So, um, imagine for a second that you stumble across this incredibly complex, highly advanced piece of engineering architecture.
Like a blueprint for something huge.
Exactly, like a detailed schematic for a clean energy fusion reactor.
Hmm.
Or, maybe the foundational source code for a completely stable global operating
You're
system.
right. Something that could completely change how everything works.
Yeah. But instead of handing this blueprint over to structural engineers or systems analysts to actually build the thing, it gets handed to a choir.
Oh, wow. Okay. So they take these complex mathematical equations and they just turn them into a melody.
Right. They literally start chanting the safety protocols. They burn incense around the schematics. They put the blueprints in this beautiful glass case. And for centuries, the entire community just assumes this technical document is like a collection of beautiful mystical poetry.
Meanwhile, I'm guessing the actual reactor is completely offline.
Totally offline. The power grid is failing. Everyone is sitting around in the cold and the dark, looking up at the sky, wondering why the lights are out.
And they just assume the architect who wrote the blueprint is, mysteriously testing their patience.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we're doing today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a foundational text. Specifically, we're looking at a detailed analysis of Surah An-Nur, verses 40 through 52.
Which is pulled from Lecture 8 of a 10-part Tilu Islam digital audio series, right?
Yes, that's the source. And our mission today is to read this text not as a book of religious hymns, but as a cold, hard survival manual for human civilization. We are completely stripping away the theological sentimentality.
Which is a huge shift. We're looking at this strictly through the lens of sociology and systems engineering.
Right, because the traditional framework usually treats the human being as, well, like a subject begging an unpredictable monarch for favors.
Yeah, but this structural analysis treats the human being as an operator within a highly rational, mathematically predictable system.
And the core argument we're exploring is that the physical laws of the universe actually provide a literal, functional blueprint for a rational human order, a socioeconomic code.
But to even start building that order, we basically have to explode a massive myth right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it all revolves around one specific verse.
Yeah.
Verse 24.41. It's kind of the hinge for this entire concept.
Do you have the Arabic there? Let's hear it.
Yeah, I do. He goes, Alam tara anna Allahu yusabihu lahu man fiyas samawati wal ard wa tayru safatin kulum qad alima salatahu ha tasbihahu.
Okay, and the standard translation for that.
It usually reads something like, do you not see that everything in the heavens and the earth makes tasbih to God? And the birds in formation, each one knows its salah and its tasbih.
Right, and the standard interpretation of that verse is, well, it's highly performative. People read that and they picture this mystical universal choir.
Yeah, like the birds are literally singing praises, the trees are bowing in worship, the planets are humming hymns.
Exactly. It frames the entire cosmos as participating in this continuous magical liturgical service. But this systems engineering reading completely dismantles that idea.
It really does. It flips the whole narrative.
Yeah.
It argues that the word tasbih has absolutely nothing to do with liturgical praise.
Nothing at all. If we strip away the choir imagery, what the text is actually describing when it looks at those birds in formation is aerodynamics.
Wait, aerodynamics, just purely physical operation.
Yes. It is describing the functional, optimal operation of an entity according to its intrinsic designed purpose. The birds in formation aren't holding a religious service up there in the clouds.
They're just operating at peak aerodynamic efficiency.
Exactly. They are utilizing air currents, they're reducing drag, conserving energy, navigating these vast, futureless spaces. Their tasbih is the flawless execution of their internal programming.
And the verse mentions their salah, too. So their salah is just their operational duty within that broader ecosystem.
That's it. The universe's tasbih is simply the observation that every single subsystem of creation operates according to its intrinsic design law.
So, like, the planets maintain their orbits not out of devotion, but because they're executing gravitational physics perfectly.
Right. And let's actually dig into the linguistic roots here, because understanding the etymology clarifies this whole engineering mindset.
Yeah, the source material goes pretty deep into the roots of these words.
It does. The root of tasbih essentially represents an entity exerting its absolute maximum energy to fulfill its specific designated program.
Like pushing itself to the limit.
Exactly. The source uses some really vital physical analogies here. Think about a galloping horse.
Okay, a horse running at full speed.
Right. When that horse is extending its legs to the absolute physical limit, stretching its whole muscular structure as far as it can go to cover maximum ground, that relentless physical drive to fulfill its kinetic potential,
Okay.
that is Tasbeeh.
Oh, wow. So it's not a chant, it's action.
Mm.
The source also used a swimmer analogy, didn't it?
Yeah, an expert swimmer, an Olympic swimmer pushing through the water isn't just floating passively, right?
No, every muscle group is coordinated. Their arms are extending fully to cut through the resistance. They're managing oxygen intake perfectly.
Exactly. It is dynamic, purposeful, functional action. That's Tasbeeh.
But then the analysis compares that dynamic action to how the word Tasbeeh is commonly used today.
Yeah.
And the contrast is just devastating.
It really is a sharp, almost biting structural critique.
Yeah, the text points out this image of a person sitting on a street corner, entirely disengaged from the socioeconomic machinery of society.
They're producing absolutely nothing. They solve no problems.
They just sit there, mechanically moving their fingers over a long string of prayer beads, which ironically are literally called a tasbih.
Right. Begging for resources while endlessly chanting, Allah, Allah.
And the text diagnoses that behavior not as piety, but as an insult to the actual operating system.
It's a complete systemic failure. That person believes they are aligned with the universe simply by making a sound with their mouth. But structurally, they're broken gear.
True alignment requires functional action. It means you actually have to engage with reality.
Because the universe doesn't recognize empty repetition. The universe recognizes physics, biology, and applied effort.
Okay, so if Tasbeeh is the ultimate conscious functional operation of a system, what happens when humans fail to operate consciously?
Well, when a civilization defaults to performative chanting instead of functional engineering, it sinks. The text describes it as sinking into layers of darkness.
And that brings us to section 2, which introduces these two specific terms that the text redefines, zulm and dhulumat.
Right. In common everyday language, we usually hear zulm translated as cruelty or oppression.
But when you read it like a systems engineer, it means structural misplacement. It literally means putting something where it does not belong.
The classic analogy from the source is putting a wolf in charge of the sheep.
Right. If a society installs a wolf as the shepherd, the resulting slaughter isn't just, an unfortunate event. It's a fundamental structural error.
Because the wolf is simply executing its intrinsic program. It eats sheep. That's what it does.
So the zulm of the systemic oppression actually lies with the architect who organized the system that way.
Exactly. You took an entity and placed it in a role that inherently contradicts the operating parameters of that role.
And then there's dhulumat, which means darknesses, plural. This refers to the compounding nature of these errors, right?
Yeah, you build one structural error on top of another, you put the wolf in charge of the sheep, and then you put a fox in charge of the henhouse.
And then you ask the termite to guard the wooden foundations.
Right. Eventually, the entire architecture of the society is operating in complete darkness. It's inevitably trending toward a total collapse.
And the source identifies a primary mechanism that drives a society into this compounding darkness. It's a concept called Taqlid.
This is such a fascinating part of the analysis. The linguistic root of Taqlid is so revealing regarding human psychology.
It completely changes how we view tradition.
Yeah.
Because Taqlid is usually just defined as blind imitation or, following the legacy of the ancestors.
But the literal Arabic root, it means tying a rope around an animal's neck to lead it.
Wow, tying a rope around a neck. So when humans operate their society via blind tradition, when they govern just by quoting dead figures.
Or when they rely entirely on legacy logic without applying any independent, rational analysis to their current conditions.
They're essentially tying a rope around their own intellect.
They hand the leash to someone who no longer exists, and by doing that, they forfeit their own self-consciousness.
It's like outsourcing your civilization's operating system to outdated, buggy legacy code. It actively destroys the system.
Because an animal has basic consciousness, right? It feels hunger, it responds to immediate stimuli. But humans require self-consciousness to function within a rational order. We have to possess an active eye that observes, hypothesizes, and makes structural decisions.
And outsourcing your cognitive agency to the past just erases that eye. You become a ghost in your own machine.
And the philosophical claim made in the text here is really profound. It says that denying your own conscious existence, erasing your I through blind imitation, is actually worse than denying a creator.
Wait, really? Worse than denying the creator?
Yes. Because if you deny your own self, you aren't even present in reality to engage with the universe's system.
You can't perform your functional operation, your tasbih, because you're just a meat robot running a script you didn't write.
And a script you can't adapt. If a society is full of people who have tied that rope around their own necks, they can't adapt to new data.
And the compounding effect of this, the Dhulumat, is described using this incredibly vivid ocean metaphor in the source material.
Oh, the deep underwater imagery.
Yeah. The text pictures someone deep underwater in a vast ocean. That is one layer of a darkness. Then above them, there are waves crashing, layered upon other waves. That's a second layer.
And then above the ocean, the sky is choked with thick black clouds, blocking out the sun entirely. Darkness upon darkness.
And the verse says, a person trapped in this state holds out their own hand and cannot even perceive it.
Because they've lost the eye. They can no longer perceive their own agency. They're completely blind to the structural reality around them.
But, this raises a pretty terrifying question for the listener. If human societies are so prone to running this buggy legacy code and plunging into darkness, where is the master blueprint?
Right. If Surah An-Nur is an operating manual, where does it point us to actually find the correct system parameters?
Exactly. And the answer the text gives is, it points us directly to the physical universe. The Earth's own resource management system is the blueprint.
Which brings us to the deconstruction of verse 24.43, the verse about the rain cycle.
Yeah, I have the Arabic for that one too. Alam tara ana, Allah yushji sahabantuma yolifu bainahutuma, yajuluhu rukaman, fatara awaraka yakhruju min hilalihi.
So, do you not see that God drives the clouds, then joins them together, then makes them into a mass, and you see the rain emerging from within?
Right. And when you first look at this, it feels really jarring.
It does.
I mean, we're reading a sociological text about the survival of human civilization, and suddenly we get a lesson in planetary meteorology. Why is a planetary plumbing system situated right in the middle of a socioeconomic manual?
Because, as the analysis insists, this is not a nature documentary meant to make you feel theological wonder.
Okay, then what is it?
It's an introduction to the Qadar principle, the law of measured, governed provision.
Qadar,
Yeah.
measured provision.
Process. The universe operates on a highly sophisticated, mathematically predictable water filtration and distribution system. And because human society exists within this physical hardware, our social and economic architecture has to emulate the principles of that hardware.
So let's look at this purely as supply chain logistics, because the efficiency the text points out is just staggering.
It really is. Think about the ocean.
Right. The vast majority of water on Earth is in the ocean, and it is entirely toxic to human life. It's saturated with salt.
So what does the planetary system do? It utilizes solar thermal energy to draw the water up. It's a massive automated desalination and distillation plant.
The water is perfectly purified. But then the system requires transport.
Naturally, so it utilizes atmospheric pressure and wind currents to move these massive water tanks, the clouds, over the terrestrial land masses.
And it doesn't just dump the entire supply at once,
Yeah.
right? Which would cause catastrophic flooding. It accounts for storage.
Right, it stores the water on mountain peaks in the form of snow and ice. The text refers to these as permanent overhead reservoirs.
That's such an engineering term, overhead reservoirs.
But that's exactly what they are. They hold the resource during the winter and then slowly, predictably release it as temperatures rise during the agricultural growing season.
And it even manages the last mile delivery and filtration. The water doesn't just flow over the contaminated surface.
No, it permeates the ground. It filters through layers of rock and soil, completely protected from external pollutants.
Until it emerges as pure, distilled spring water, right where biological life needs it. The logistics are flawless.
Flawless. And the critical socioeconomic synthesis drawn from this process is the absence of hoarding.
Okay, this is the core of it.
Yes. The universe does not hoard resources. The life-sustaining provision, the water, is not claimed as personal property by the mountains.
The clouds don't behave as monopolies, saying, hey, we collected this moisture, it belongs exclusively to us.
Exactly. The mountains do not build borders around the snowpack to artificially restrict supply and drive up the price of water.
But I have to challenge this a bit, based on what the listener might be thinking.
Sure, go ahead.
You're saying the universe is this perfect, unhoarded system. But if you look at biology, look at nature, squirrels hoard nuts for the winter, bears hoard fat. Doesn't the physical universe actually reward hoarding on an individual biological level?
That is a crucial distinction to make. What the squirrel and the bear are doing is functional seasonal storage.
Functional storage, so equivalent to the mountain holding the snow.
Exactly. It's a temporary buffer designed to ensure survival through a period of low resource availability. And critically, the resource is entirely consumed by the biological unit that stored it. That is functional operation.
Okay, I see.
Systemic hoarding, which is what humans do, is entirely different. Human hoarding is artificial scarcity.
It's a single entity accumulating resources far beyond their biological or functional capacity to consume.
Yes, permanently removing those resources from circulation and then using that concentrated accumulation to exert structural control over other entities.
Oh, wow. So a squirrel burying nuts is a mountain holding snow. But a billionaire hoarding wealth is a dam that stops the river entirely.
Yes, and causing the ecosystem downstream to turn into a desert.
That makes perfect sense. The water in the planetary system is distributed systematically and equitably to wherever it's needed to sustain life.
Therefore, a human economic architecture must emulate this continuous, unhoarded flow.
If the universe's fundamental operating system is based on equitable circulation, then an economy running on artificial scarcity and monopolies is fundamentally incompatible code.
You're actively fighting the hardware.
And when software fights hardware, the software eventually crashes, every time.
Right. If your civilization's economy is based on a fraction of the population hoarding the equivalent of the global water supply, while the rest of the population is dying of thirst, your civilization will inevitably collapse because it violates the base physics of its environment.
And the rain cycle demonstrates that the system is reliable. You don't have to pray for the clouds to do their job.
No, you have to build the socioeconomic infrastructure, the reservoirs, the irrigation channels, the equitable distribution networks to utilize the water that the system predictably provides.
Okay, so the physical universe provides the resources, but it also provides the medium in which human action and progress can actually be measured, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because without this medium, we couldn't even build the infrastructure we just talked about.
Yeah.
And this brings us to section 4, the architecture of reality, specifically time.
Right. The source moves from the rain cycle immediately to verse 24.44, which focuses on the alternation of night and day.
Let me read that one. Yuqalibu Allahu al-layla wan-nahara inna fi dhalika la ibratan li uli al-absar.
God alternates night and day, and that is a lesson for those with vision.
And once again, the intent is not to just marvel at a sunset, is it?
Not at all. There is a deep structural purpose to this binary alternation of night and day. The philosophical framework here introduces the difference between serial time and durationless time.
Durationless time. The source used a coma analogy for this, right?
Yes. Think about someone waking up from a deep, prolonged coma. Whether they have been unconscious for 6 hours or 6 months, they have absolutely no internal concept of how much time has passed.
They experienced duration, but because they lacked markers, it was just a blur.
Exactly. Without the specific binary alternation of light and dark, human consciousness would be trapped in that blur.
If the sun remained permanently fixed in the sky, or if the earth was in perpetual darkness, we could experience duration, but we couldn't measure it.
But by alternating light and dark, the universe creates serial time. It chops that infinite duration into discrete, measurable units a day.
And you cannot build a complex civilization without measurable units of time. I mean, serial time allows for accounting. It allows us to keep historical records.
It allows you to map out agricultural planting seasons, to calculate wages for labor, to measure the velocity of progress.
If you cannot measure time, you cannot build a socioeconomic architecture. The ticking clock of the day and night cycle is literally the canvas upon which human progress is drawn.
And the verse ends by stating, "In this is a lesson for those with vision." But the specific Arabic word used for lesson is really important here. The word is ibra.
Ibra. What's the linguistic root of that?
It means crossing a bridge. It means traversing from one side of a river to the other.
Oh, that changes the entire mandate of the observer. Those with vision don't just passively watch the sun go down and think, oh, what a beautiful sunset.
No, they cross the bridge. They move from the raw, observable data. The sun goes down, it gets dark, the sun comes up, it gets light, to the profound underlying systemic reality.
They cross over to the realization that the cosmos is highly ordered, mathematically reliable, and inherently measurable.
And because it is reliable, we can construct a rational civilization upon it. If you merely watch the days pass without engaging with the mechanics of the system, You're just standing frozen on the bank of the river.
Ibra is the active intellectual crossing from observation to systemic understanding.
Exactly.
I mean, think about your own day-to-day life if you're listening to this. Are you just watching the hours pass in a blur, experiencing durationless time, or are you actually crossing the bridge?
Are you observing the reliability of the systems around you and actively engineering your life and your community upon them?
That is the critical transition in the text. We've established that the physical universe operates flawlessly. The water flows, the earth turns, time is measured.
But human beings possess agency. We have the capacity to observe the perfect planetary system and still choose to write terrible code.
We do it all the time. So how do we run a diagnostic test on our own social engine? How do we know if a human community is actually aligned with this universal system?
We test the social engine through arbitration. And this is detailed in verses 24.47 through 51.
The arbitration test.
Right. The text outlines a scenario involving people who vocally claim they are running the correct operating system. With their tongues, they say, Samina Watana, we hear and we obey.
But vocal affirmation is cheap.
Incredibly cheap. The true diagnostic test is legal and economic arbitration. What happens when a dispute arises within the community?
The text observes that when these individuals are called to the rational law, or to the messenger for arbitration to resolve a conflict, their true internal operating system is laid bare.
They run a personal calculation. They realize that if they submit to the universal equitable law, they might lose money.
Or they might have to return the stolen land, or they might lose their social status.
Exactly. So what do? They turn away. They seek out local customs, legal loopholes, or ancestral traditions that they know are biased in their favor.
They actively bypass the rational system to secure an immediate personal advantage.
And the text diagnoses this behavior as a disease in their hearts. It is a fundamental systemic corruption.
Because they're merely performing an allegiance to the system, but when the pressure tests the architecture, they actively sabotage it.
It's like they're wearing the uniform of the engineering firm, but they are secretly wiring the fusion reactor to bypass the safety valves so they can steal a little extra power for their own house.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the text contrasts this systemic corruption with the true mu'min. Verse 24.51. إنما كان المؤمنين إذا إليه الله ورسوله ليحكم بينهم أن يخلصوا من وطنا.
Usually mu'min is translated simply as believer, right?
Right, but in this structural framework, a mu'min is a guarantor of peace. They are the true participant, the reliable operator of the rational system.
And when faced with arbitration, their response is unequivocally, Samina Watana, we hear and obey.
And the defining characteristic is that they submit to this rational justice process, even when the judgment goes against their personal gain.
That is the ultimate litmus test. The willingness to accept an equitable, rational outcome when it costs you something separates the operators from the performers.
If a community chants slogans of justice right up until the moment the law requires them to pay fair wages,
or to step down from a position of unearned power,
and then they suddenly discover an excuse to ignore that law, that community is running a theatrical performance. They are not running a civilization.
Your willingness to submit to equitable arbitration when it hurts your bottom line is the only metric that matters. It determines if you are a functioning gear driving the machinery forward or if you are sand destroying the gears.
Which brings us to the inevitable output of the entire process. Section 6. If a community actually manages to run this full stack.
Right. If they execute their functional operation without falling into the blind imitation of Taqlid.
If they manage their resources equitably, like the planetary water cycle, if they utilize serial time efficiently, and if they submit to rational arbitration, what is the system output?
The text calls this the law of requital, mukafat-i amal, and verse 24.52 defines the output.
Let's hear it. وَمَنْ يُطِيعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيَخْشَى اللَّهَ وَيَتَّقِ فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْفَائِزُونَ.
Those are the successful ones. The word used is faizun. We really have to contrast two distinct concepts here to fully grasp the magnitude of this. Natshat versus faz.
Natshat versus faz. So many people operate their entire lives on the concept of natshat without even realizing it.
They do. In traditional, sentiment-driven religious frameworks, the ultimate goal is nashat. The word essentially translates to salvation or deliverance.
But linguistically, what does it mean?
It means being rescued from a trap or escaping a punishment. The analysis uses the analogy of recovering from a severe illness, like a high fever. When the fever finally breaks and you recover, you have achieved Najat.
Wait, so if Najat is just surviving a fever, it means you're just back at baseline.
Exactly.
You haven't actually built anything, you haven't grown stronger, you haven't produced a surplus, you've simply stopped dying.
Right. Najat is a purely defensive posture. It is crisis management. But verse 24.52 does not promise Najat. It promises Faz.
And what's the root of Faz?
It's an agricultural term. It means a harvest. It implies tremendous achievement, compounding growth, and tangible civilizational success.
So it's not returning to baseline. It is producing something magnificent that did not exist before.
Escaping a burning farm is Najat. But planting seeds, understanding the water cycle to irrigate them, utilizing cereal time to track the seasons, and bringing in a massive harvest that feeds the entire region. That is Faz.
And this connects directly to the law of requital, mukafat e amal. The harvest Faz is not a magical reward handed down because a community held the correct theological beliefs in their hearts.
No, it is the natural, guaranteed, mathematically inevitable output of running the system correctly.
It's pure cause and effect. If I understand the soil, if I water the crops, and if I have a rational arbitration system so my neighbors don't steal my yield, the output is a harvest.
I don't need a miracle to feed my community. I need to run the code.
Exactly. A civilization that aligns its social, economic, and legal architecture with universal operating principles will inevitably achieve civilizational success.
It's not a divine reward for being pious. It is the natural output of an equation solved correctly.
Let's synthesize this whole journey. We started with a text that is almost universally treated as a book of mystical poetry, and we read it as a cold, hard operating manual.
We move from the myth of a universe magically singing hymns to the reality of a highly structured cosmos where everything exerts its full energy to fulfill its design. That's true, Tasbeeh.
We examine the compounding darkness, the Dhulumat that occurs when we erase our own agency through blind tradition, Taqlid.
We saw how the planetary water cycle, the biquitar principle, demands an unhoarded, equitable economic structure.
We discussed how the day and night cycle provides the serial time necessary for human progress, challenging us to cross the bridge Ibra from observation to systemic understanding.
And we established that the diagnostic test of a society isn't its slogans, but its submission to equitable arbitration when it hurts.
Run all that code correctly, and the output is a harvest of civilizational success. Faz.
The overarching takeaway here is continuity. A community implementing these codes is not being religious in some detached spiritual sense.
They're just aligning themselves with the grain of the universe.
Right. The operating system of the physical cosmos and the optimal operating system of human society are the exact same code.
Which means when a society hoards wealth, when it relies on legacy code, when it rejects justice, its inevitable collapse isn't some mystical divine punishment.
It is merely physics rejecting bad code. If you build a bridge using flawed mathematics and the bridge collapses, gravity isn't punishing you.
Gravity is just operating correctly. Your math was wrong. The universe is just rejecting bad code.
Exactly.
Think back to the blueprint we discussed at the very beginning. Every single subsystem in the physical universe, the birds, the clouds, the rotation of the Earth, inherently knows its optimal function and operates flawlessly within its design.
So the ultimate paradox of the human condition is that we possess the unique cognitive capacity to understand this master system, yet we consistently choose to build structures that violate it.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. At what point in history did human civilization look at the blueprint and decide to actively write socioeconomic code that fundamentally conflicts with its own hardware?
It's a terrifying thought.
And if we are currently running legacy code full of compounding errors in a universe that demands absolute functional alignment, how long do we have until the universe forces a hard reboot?
Something to really think about.
Keep digging, keep questioning, and stop singing the blueprint. Start building the reactor.